Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Today we're going to be talking about the spread of Islam, and a question that a lot of non-Muslims put forward, and a claim that they make to refute Islam and the truthhood about Islam. And they try to make it sound like a barbaric, warlike religion by saying that Islam was actually spread by the sword. And here today we're going to be refuting that claim and show that not only was it not spread by the sword, but the spread of Islam is actually something that can be used to prove the veracity and truthhood of Islam and show that it is the one true religion. So let's begin by talking about how Islam was spread. And to do that, we need to go back all the way to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam during the Battle of the Khandaq, or commonly known in English as the Battle of the Trench, or the Confederates, the Battle of the Ditch. There are many names. So what was happening was, during this Medinan period when the Muslims were in exile, this was the third major battle between the Muslims and the pagans, and the Meccans. So what happened was the Meccans and the pagans and the Jewish tribe, they created an alliance and formed an army of 10,000 men. And this 10,000 men, they started marching on Medina. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, under the advice of Salman al-Farsi, who was a Persian, a companion, radiallahu anhu, he advised that they build a trench around Medina. And so while they were to protect themselves from the incoming army, because they didn't have the manpower to destroy and defeat a 10,000 man army in the field. The Muslims numbered around 3,000 at max. So what happened was, while building this trench, they came upon a rock that none of them could break because it was in the way. The big guys, Umar radiallahu anh, all the big Sahabas, they were trying and nobody could do it. So then they went to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, Ya Rasulullah, we're trying to break this rock, but none of us can do it. Can you come and help us? So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have to understand, he's over 50 years old at this time. And so he says, okay, fine. And he goes to destroy and break the rock. So while breaking this rock, he hits it 3 times. Upon the first time, once he hits the rock, there's like a flash. And the Prophet ﷺ says, Allahu Akbar, meaning Allah is the greatest. And he hits it a second time, and the same thing happens. He hits it a third time, and the same thing happens. There's a flash, and he says, there's a big flash, and he says, Allahu Akbar. And so what happens is, the companions, they don't know why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did this. And he says, he asked them, they ask him, Ya Rasulullah, we saw you shouting Allahu Akbar when this happened. Why did you do that? And so he replied by saying, the first time when I hit the rock, I was shown a vision, and I saw that Allah had granted me the keys to Syria. By Allah, I can see its red palaces from here. At the second strike, he was again shown a vision, and he said, Allah has granted me the keys to Persia. By Allah, I can see Madain from here. And Madain is, I think it's known as Ctesiphon, which was the capital of the Persian Empire. And on the third strike, he said, I have been granted the keys to Yemen. By Allah, I can see the palaces of Sana'a from here. And so you have to understand that the condition that the Muslims were in at this time, they're facing extinction right now. They're in exile, and they have 10,000 men marching on them. They don't have any food, so much so that the companions, they were tying stones around their stomachs to keep themselves going. This was the condition they're in. And at this time, a small group of men, they don't number more than 5,000, men, women, and children. And they're saying, and the Prophet Muhammad is telling them that you will conquer Syria, and you will conquer Persia, and you'll conquer Yemen. And now, you have to understand that Persia and the Roman Empire, they're no joke, really. They are no joke. They are a big superpowers. So much so that a historian, Barnaby Rogers, he says the following. you have to remember the two great superpowers at that time were the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. If you're putting it into a modern parlance, it's a bit like Eskimos taking on the USA and Russia at the same time. And this is a huge statement. You have to really understand how big the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, they were two of the greatest empires to ever exist. Huge numbers they had, over hundreds of thousands of men. And the Prophet is telling them right now, the Prophet ﷺ is telling them, one day you will conquer these empires. And this shows, this prophecy, it shows the truth of Islam, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he's prophesying this at a very, very dire time. And in less than 50 years or so, I say less than 30 years or even 20 years, Syria has fallen to the Muslims. Persia has been completely obliterated by the Muslims, and so has Yemen. Yemen is under Muslim rule. Let's go through some of these conquests. So Syria, the conquest started, the army was dispatched during the last few years of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and obviously he passed away, so he wasn't able to deal with the conquest, and it came down to the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and the army was dispatched. And what is happening at the same time, the rebels from other Arab territories who were Muslims, and now at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's death, they started rebelling and refusing to pray salah and pay the zakah. And some of them were pretending to be prophets, the fake prophets, like such as Musaylimah al-Kadhdhab, which resulted in the Battle of Yamama. These series of battles are known as the Ridda Wars, the civil wars where Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he had to deal with these rebellions. And at the same time, people were calling for him to get the army that was dispatched to Syria, get them back and help them to fight, because this was the main army. And he asked, the people were asking him to get the army back and help to fight on the Arab front where the Ridda Wars were happening. And and this is a testimony to his to how much love he had for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and how upright he was in his faith, where he says, I will never ever retract an order that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made. I will never ever retract that. I will never get rid of it. I will follow with what he's done. And seeing that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was the one who dispatched the army, he didn't withdraw the army to fight. And of course, he was successful in the Ridda Wars, and it is during the time of the Umar radiallahu anhu, Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, the second Caliph of Islam, where the real conquest they start to take place, such as we see the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD under Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu's command. The Muslim army completely obliterates the Roman army at Yarmouk. And we have to understand how many men they had. It was about 42,000 men the Muslims had, and on the other side, the conservative estimate of the Roman Empire, the men they had, was 150,000. And this is huge, 42,000 against 150,000. But the Muslims were, alhamdulillah, they completely obliterated the Romans, and this was in 636. And Syria is completely, by 638, Syria has completely succumbed to the Arabs. And Professor Andrew Louth, a serious historian, he says in his book, he says, the speed at which the provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire succumbed to the Arabs remains to be explained by historians. And this shows that historians, they don't know how to explain how fast the Muslims took the territories that they did, such as the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. In the span of Umar radiallahu anhu, he comes in to he takes control of the Muslims, becomes the Caliph at the I believe it was 635 AD. He becomes the Caliph, and in the space of 1 year, he has hugely defeated the Romans at the Battle of Yarmouk, and by 638 AD he has taken Syria, the Levant region, from the Romans. And then in 637 we have Ctesiphon, which was completely destroyed. The Persian Empire was completely obliterated by the Muslims, and Ctesiphon, which was the capital, known as Madain, in 637, the Muslims also take it after the victories in places like Qadisiyah. And Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, who is a historian, he talks about the conquest, and he says that the campaigns were the first of a wonderful series of campaigns by the Muslims, which spread throughout Syria and parts of North Africa all the way to Iraq and Iran. And during the Caliphate of Umar radiallahu anhu, the Muslims, the Khilafah is spread from steppes of China all the way to North Africa towards southern France, which shows how quickly they spread. And it goes back to what our Professor Andrew Louth said, and how historians they fail to explain how quickly an empire can spread from being such a desolate people to struggling to eat, and then to be able to conquer Syria, Persia, North Africa, and even Spain. And he says, I'll say it one more time, the speed at which the provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire succumbed to the Arabs remains to be explained by historians. The resulting empire stretched from the steppes of China to Iraq, Syria, North Africa, and even Spain. And now we need to look at whether this empire, was it really spread by the sword? When these invasions took place, did they really force the Christian Arabs or the Zoroastrians or whatever they were to accept Islam? Now, we can go back to our Orientalist, Thomas Arnold Walker, who says, toleration extended towards Christian Arabs by victorious Muslims. We can surely infer that those Christian tribes who did embrace Islam did so of their own free will. The Christian Arabs living among the Muhammadan population today are a living testimony to this toleration. Now, Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, he's an Orientalist, and a lot of Orientalists, they try to use the spread of Islam and many other things to falsify Islam and show that it is a religion, warlike religion, and feed these right-wing narratives. But he himself, he candidly admits that they weren't forcibly, there weren't any forcible conversions. We can look at also other historians such as Marshall Hodgson, and in his book, The Venture of Islam, he says the exact same thing. And then we also have, I'm not sure he says his name, I think it's Ira Lapidus. He writes in his book, The History of Islamic Societies. And he writes that European scholars believe that conversions to Islam were made at the point of the sword, and that conquered peoples were given the choice of conversion or death. So this is what European scholars believe. They believe that conversions to Islam were made at the point of the sword, and that there was, conversion to Islam or death. It is now apparent that conversions by force, while not unknown in Muslim countries, was in fact rare. Muslim conquerors ordinarily wished to dominate rather than convert, and most conversions to Islam were voluntary. And this is in line with what Sir Thomas Arnold Walker also says. Another Orientalist, De Lacy O'Leary, who chopped away at the narrative of forced conversions to Islam, completely saying that stuff like this doesn't exist. O'Leary wrote in 1923 that the legend of fanatical Muslims sweeping through the sword and forcing Islam at the point of the sword upon conquered races is one of the most fantastically absurd myths that historians have ever repeated. Again, showing that these things, forcible conversions, if they did exist, they were very, very rare. And during the time of the Rashidun Khilafah, which we are going to mainly explore today, that there are no forcible conversions. Ira Lapidus again says, the Arab conquerors did not require the conversion as much as the subordination of non-Muslim peoples. At the outset, they were hostile to conversion because new Muslims diluted the economic and status advantage of the Arabs. Again, this is showing that they didn't want non-Muslims to convert because it got rid of the status that the Arabs had. And then what we can see is if you look at the Umayyad period, at the end of the Umayyad period, less than 10% of the people in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, Tunisia, and Spain were Muslim. Less than 10% of the population in these countries were Muslim. It was only in the Arabian Peninsula which this proportion of Muslims was higher than the countries that I mentioned earlier. So what we can infer from these sources that I've stated is that the forcible conversions towards Islam, they were very rare and they really happened. This is something that has been made up by European historians, the Orientalists, and the far right, narratives to try and portray Islam as this barbaric, warlike religion. But if you look at in the academic field and from an academic narrative, these things, they didn't exist and they are easily falsifiable. Now, another point I want to put forward is that invasions they were welcomed by non-Muslims. And now, what I'm trying to say is that invasions, the non-Muslims, they weren't hostile to these invasions that these far-right, right-wing narrative says. If you look at Michael the Elder, he was a Jacobite patriarch of Antioch. In his book, the Chronicle, I can't remember the book name, but he says in his book, I'll put it in the description, the Romans who throughout their dominion cruelly plundered our churches and monasteries and condemned us, brought from the region of the south the children of Ismail, who would deliver us from the Romans. So what he's trying to say is that the Romans, they would actually persecute some Christians, such as the Jacobites, and the invasions were actually welcomed by some Christians. And a lot of what they're trying to say, this is a Christian source who's saying that the invasions were welcomed. See, this completely destroys the right-wing narrative, which these academic, frauds that they try to put forward to you, that Islam was spread by the sword. Nobody wanted the Muslims to spread Islam and things like this. This is completely wrong, because a Christian, Jacob, he was Jacobite patriarch of Antioch. He is saying that the Romans used to persecute us, and the Romans, they brought forth from the south the children of Ismail who would deliver us from the Romans and their persecution. And then we have a book called Futuh al-Sham by Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Azdi. And in his book, a Christian, he writes that we prefer you, talking about the Muslims, we prefer you to the Byzantines because you are better in your faith and more merciful. Again, showing that the fact that, invasions were welcomed by the non-Muslims and that they weren't, the invasions by the non-Muslims, the Christians were not hostile to this. And another claim that the, academic frauds and people who don't really know much about Islam, they will put forward the claim about jizya. And they will say that this jizya, which was, let me first talk about what the jizya was. The jizya was something that the non-Muslims who were living under Muslim rule would pay to the Muslim authorities so that they were offered protection against anybody who would try to come and invade. Now, what the right-wing narrative is that this jizya is a form of oppression and to marginalize the non-Muslims and make them look like second-class citizens. But this is completely wrong. Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, will go back to our Orientalist. He says, the jizya was levied upon able-bodied men in lieu of military service that they would be called upon to partake in. When they served in this army, they were excused from paying this tax. And what this shows, what Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, he candidly admits that this he says this in his book, that the jizya is actually a symbol of toleration and not oppression against non-Muslims. It's to offer them protection. And this claim, you can look more about jizya in earlier videos. There's one video titled Jews Under Muslims, where we talk a little bit more about the jizya. Another thing that I'd like to tackle through what they say related to jizya is that, the Christians are second-class citizens, non-Muslims, they're treated as second-class citizens and oppressed. This is wrong. Christians, they actually had high posts in places where Muslims were in control. Like Al-Akhtal, who was a non-Muslim under Muslim control. He was actually a court poet. Another thing that we can use to falsify this claim is we look at the journey of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu into Jerusalem. And this is one of my favorite stories in the Islamic history. What he says here, what happens here is that what's happening is that the Muslims are now encamped outside Jerusalem and they're about to conquer Jerusalem. And what happens is the patriarch of Jerusalem, what he says is that the Romans, they had abandoned Jerusalem at this point because they knew that it was futile to try and attempt any resilience against such a powerful Muslim army, which again relates back to our quote from Sir Professor Andrew Louth, who talks about the spread of Islam and how it shocked historians. And so what happened during this journey is that they ask Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu they say to the Muslims that if the patriarch of Jerusalem, he offers the Muslims a deal. He says that if your Khalif, if he comes and he takes the key, we will offer Jerusalem. So we will offer Jerusalem to you if he comes and he takes the key himself. So obviously the message was sent to Umar radiallahu anhu, who was in Medina. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he obviously holds a council, decides what to do. And some advise him not to go, stay in Medina. There are generals out there, they're there in the field, they can deal with it. But Ali radiallahu anhu says, no, you go. And so he takes the opinion of Ali radiallahu anhu and he decides to go to Jerusalem. And what happens is when he does go there, he goes in a very, very humble manner. They initially set out with to transport 2 camels, but obviously one of them was a bit ill, so he died on the way, and there is only 1 camel left now. And what happens is it's him and his assistant, and because there's only 1 camel now, they're taking turns. Imagine Umar radiallahu anhu, he was the Khalif of one of the largest empires to ever exist in history, the 7th largest empire to ever exist in history. That is what he was the ruler of, and he is taking turns to share a camel with his assistant. And this just shows how great the character of the Sahaba was. And so what happens is he's obviously taking turns, and then once they enter into Jerusalem, just before they enter into Jerusalem, a really nice story that they come upon Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu. He sees the clothes there are multiple narrations of what happened, but the gist of the story is that Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu, who was the commander of the Muslim armies, he sees Umar radiallahu anhu in a very, a state that is not becoming, let's say, of a ruler of such a large empire. He was wearing clothes that weren't fancy. They had 16 patches, they were muddy. And he's saying, Ya Umar, Ya Amirul Mu'mineen, I don't think these non-Muslims, they will respect you based on, how you look like. I don't think they will give you a status deserving of what you are. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he says something very, very famous. He says here that, "O Abu Ubaidah, do you not remember a time when we were the most disgraced people upon the face of the earth?" And he's talking about the period of Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period. And he says, "Do you not remember a time when we were the most disgraced people on earth? And but then Allah, He honored us with Islam. If we seek honor from anything else apart from Islam, Allah will humiliate us." And this is a very, very famous quote of Umar radiallahu anh. And it just shows why the Muslims are in the desperate and low state they are today. So he goes into Jerusalem, and the Christians, they cannot believe what they're seeing. And when he goes in to Jerusalem, obviously they're taking turn. It's the turn of the servant, of his assistant, to ride the camel. And so the assistant tells him, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, let me walk. You're the Amir al-Mu'mineen. You ride on the camel. He says, no. It's your turn. You ride. So the servant rides the camel, and Umar radiallahu anh is walking, and people are thinking that it's his assistant who is the Amir al-Mu'mineen, not Umar radiallahu anh. And it's amazing, And the fact that what he does here is he signs something called the Pact of Umar radiallahu anh, where he extends toleration towards the non-Muslims. He allows the Christians. He doesn't destroy any places of worship. He allows the non-Muslims, the Christians mainly, because at this time the Jews weren't here, and I'll speak about the Jews in a second. But he allows the Christians to worship peacefully. No harm will come to them. And what he does, during the time of the Christians, when they were in charge of Jerusalem, the non-Muslims, they weren't allowed to, the Jews and even Muslims, they weren't allowed to worship in Jerusalem. So much so that the temple where, the place of worship for the Jews was a waste site where the Christians would go and dump their garbage and rubbish. But Umar radiallahu anh, when he saw that, with his own hands, he tried to fix this. And you look at the story of how great this Amir al-Mu'mineen was, and this Khalif was, and how dare they come and impose this right-wing narrative on us about that Islam was spread by the sword and they were barbaric. The Umar radiallahu anh, he levied a jizya upon them of 1 gold coin. 1 gold coin, that's it. And equivalent to today's, that is only £200, £240, something like that. Imagine, you're being told to pay £240, and this is only, like Sir Thomas Arnold Walker says, only levied upon able-bodied men. Now, the Muslims themselves, they have to pay a zakat, the zakat which is based upon their earnings, their income. So even if they're earning 1 million, the zakat is based on that 1 million. And if somebody is earning 10,000, the zakat is based on that 10,000. But for a Christian or a Jew or any other non-Muslim, it doesn't matter whether they're earning £10,000 or £10 million. They will only pay 1 gold coin equivalent. And so this claim about jizya is completely ridiculous to, try and impose on the Muslims and say that, look at how you treat the non-Muslims. And yeah, having said that, that is the end of our main talk. And now we'll take a short break and be back for questions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to second part of the live stream. So the topic was Islam spread by the sword, and we do have a few questions that have been collated. So number one was, if Islam wasn't spread by the sword, what was the purpose of jihad? Now this is the question itself to ask something like this. Let me word it a little bit better. Instead of saying what was the purpose of jihad, let's say if Islam wasn't spread by the sword, let's say if Islam, what was the need for Islam to spread? Let's put it that way. And then we can understand why the jihad was done. So to ask something like this is completely wrong. It's a fallacy. Now, what we need to understand is that the period we're studying, the purpose of the fighting, it's wrong to ask why did the Muslims fight the non-Muslims, the Christians and Persians. To ask something like this is a fallacy. We need to understand that the period we're studying was the pre-modern world, where this idea of expansionism was, rather than how today it is looked down upon and trying to conquer other areas and fighting, this can go under international, it's against international law and things like this. We need to understand that in that time the expansionism was actually something that was promoted in the pre-modern world, and to actually, that this period that we're studying is more of a age of empires, where the other empires, they were looking to spread themselves. And there is nothing wrong with expanding. It is anachronistic. It's anachronism. This is what it is, to ask why did Islam spread? Because at that time there are no moral objections to expansionism. It is something that is promoted and looked up at, to have a large empire. So there is nothing wrong with Islam spreading and them fighting to conquer other lands, because this is what was happening anyways. So this is what is known as anachronism, to impose something from today, or a moral of a different time, an understanding of a different time, to another time. Like, for example, a lot of people, actually, yeah, that's just it. You can't ask a question like this, because this is a fallacy and the question itself is wrong. So there was no objection to fighting and expanding their own territory. The next question is, how was Islam spread so successfully without the sword? Okay, this is what we need to look at. Is we need to study what was happening during the conquests. And what happened is, the Christians, they were, like, if I get it back up, that a Christian wrote in Futuh al-Sham by Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Azdi. A Christian writes in his book that we prefer you to the Byzantines because you are better in your faith. Now, what we can interpret from this, as well as seeing that the Christians were not hostile towards Muslim invasions, they were also, dazzled at the faith that they had and how much taqwa and piety these Muslims had. And so it is because of that, and because of the character that the Muslims and the Sahaba radiallahu anh, that they had, that the non-Muslims accepted Islam, because they were so taken back by the amount of taqwa and piety they had. We know the stories. Even the non-Muslims, they accept the story of Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh, during the time of the Battle of Yarmouk. Jarja, he was a Roman general. And what he done is, just before the battle started, as the armies lined up, he rode over to the Muslims. He went to Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh, and he said to him that, "Oh Khalid, tell me the truth, because if you're a free man doesn't lie. So if you're a free man, tell me the truth." And Khalid radiallahu anh says, "Okay, ask a question. What do you want to know?" And Jarja, he was known as George in the modern English language. What he asks him is it true that your Nabi, your prophet, was given a sword from the heavens, and this sword was given to you, and this is why you don't lose a battle? You have never lost a battle. Khalid bin Walid says, no, this is not true. And so then Jarjah, he asks him, "Oh Khalid, if I was to accept Islam, would I be given the same rank as you, or would I be given a lower rank? Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh says, you wouldn't be given a lower rank, you wouldn't be given the same rank as me even, you would be given a higher rank than me. And Georgia says, how can I be given a higher rank than you when, you were with the Prophet Muhammad, you prayed for years, you've done all this jihad in his name, you've conquered so much land, you've given so much zakah, how can I be higher than you? Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh, he replies saying, because, we saw the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we witnessed his miracles, and we were in his company, we saw how amazing his character was, we heard him recite the Quran to us, and that's why it was easier for us to accept Islam than it is for you, because you haven't seen the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have not witnessed his miracles, you haven't heard him recite the Quran, so therefore you would be given a higher rank than me. And hearing this, Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh, Jarjah, he accepts Islam. Actually, just one more thing he did. Before he asked Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh, if I was to accept Islam, would I be given a higher rank than you? He asked him, Ya Khalid, why have you come here? What do you want? What happens if I don't accept Islam? Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh says, I've come here. Your options are, you either accept Islam, pay the jizya, or face the sword. And Khalid bin Walid radiallahu, and then what happens is Jarjah, he asks, what happens if I was to accept Islam out of curiosity? And he accepts Islam, hearing what Khalid bin Walid radiallahu says, that you would be given a higher rank than me and the other companions. Hearing this, he accepts Islam. He rides into battle with Khalid bin Walid radiallahu against the same men he marched with, and he is martyred in the same battle. So this shows that Islam was spread successfully without the sword because of the character that the Sahaba portrayed and how much humbleness they had, like we see with the journey to Jerusalem by Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. So this is the answer. Another question is, did Islamic conquest have more violence than other religions? Did Islamic conquest have more violence than other religions? This is completely wrong. 100% Islam did not have more violence than other religions in their conquests. Let's just look at, we saw Jerusalem was handed over without any fighting. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he went and he took the key. But what happened, and when they took the cities, they didn't plunder the cities, they didn't massacre the men, women, and children that were living in there. They didn't. They said, you pay the jizya. If you don't want to accept Islam, pay the jizya. If not, we will give you safe passage to go back to the Western lands, the Christian lands. Go there if you don't want to pay the jizya. But the jizya is only 1 gold coin. So they accepted, they paid the jizya. Or a lot of them accepted Islam, like Sir Thomas Arnold Walker says in his book, The Spirit of Islam. Now, what we can do now is we can look at other religions. Like, let's look at Christianity, for example. The Crusades. The Crusades were something that was blessed and called upon by the Pope, sanctioned by the Pope. He was the one who called for these Crusades to take back the Holy Lands from the, at that time was the Fatimid Khilafah. And he sanctioned it, and he called for a Holy Crusade. And in these Crusades, hundreds and thousands of men, women, and children were massacred, brutally and barbarically massacred. So much so that in the Christian chronicles, they themselves say that in Jerusalem, when we took it, the massacres were so bad that the blood of the Muslims, it flowed up to our ankles. Imagine that's how badly they catapulted people over the walls, smashed babies' heads against the walls. And do you dare say that this right-wing narrative that they try to impose on us and brainwash upon us that Islamic conquests were violent and bloody? This is completely wrong. We look at more Christian stuff. We look at the Spanish, Reconquista, where they took back Spain from the Muslims. They completely massacred the Muslims. We look at colonialism and imperialism in the name of Christianity. you can read the accounts. Of course, the British, they try to hide what actually happened, but obviously since last year these things have started to come to light, and we know all it takes is an open eye and to read a couple books that are written by academics, and not biased right-wing books, but written by academics. If you read these books, you'll see the war crimes that they committed. Obviously at that time we didn't have international courts, so we can't really call them war crimes, but the massacres that the Christians did in colonialism, in the Crusades, in the requisitions, and all these things. So to say that Islam had more violence than other religions is a complete lie. And only someone who has no academic background, who hasn't even opened a single book, will come and say this to you, because he is academically unlettered and he's a fraud and he's ignorant. And so lastly, the last question is, you said the spread of Islam was a proof for its truth. Can the spread of other religions be used to falsify their own religions? Now, 1 second. So you said the spread of Islam was a proof for its truth. Can the spread of other religions be used to falsify them? Let's look at how Christianity was spread. It's simple. The Trinity after the Nicene Creed, the Nicene Council in 380, I think it was 385 AD, the Trinity was imposed by the Roman Emperor upon those who were believing in a Unitarian, upon the Unitarians of the Roman Empire. It was imposed upon them. He went and he invited it. If you didn't accept the Trinity, you would be put to the sword. This is how Christianity was spread. It was spread by us, and I'm not trying to attack Christianity here. I'm not trying to attack Christianity, because there are, like the Quran says in chapter 3 of the Quran, verse, I believe, 110, 11, I think about verse 113 or 114, it says, Laytu sawa, that they're not all the same. The Christians and the Jews, the people of the book, they are not the same. There are, in their ranks, there are different. There are some who are respectable, and obviously there are some who are ignorant, and they do nothing but hate upon Islam and other religions. So I'm not trying to attack Christianity. All I'm trying to say is that Christianity was spread by the sword, because a lot of these non-Muslims and Christians, they will try to say that Islam was spread by the sword. But if we just look at how this Trinitarian belief that most Christians adopt today, how it was imposed by the Roman Emperor by the sword, and if you didn't accept it, you were put to the sword. So therefore, Christianity can be spread by the sword. And if Christianity was true, why on earth would you need to put a sword to people's necks and say, if you don't believe that Jesus was God and that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three co-equal, co-eternal, independent beings, then I'm going to chop your head off? Why? Why do you need to do that if it's true? Whereas Islam, it organically spread because it was true. And this leads on to our last question. How did the Sahaba propagate Islam? What was so significant about their behavior that people accepted Islam because of it? Now, how did the Sahaba propagate Islam? Well, I've talked about this earlier briefly. They weren't violent towards Christians. We only need to look at the behavior of the Amir al-Mu'mineen. We don't even need to go back to the Sahaba, because the Sahaba, they would have taken after the behavior of the Amir al-Mu'mineen, because he was Umar ibn Khattab, and he was a very, very tough guy, and if you did something wrong, he would deal with you, and not like how the Roman emperors did by putting you to the sword. I mean, he would have a bit of a word with you, that's it. But in Umar ibn Khattab, if he comes and has a word with you, then it's not going to be very pleasant. But let's just say, so how did the Sahaba, how did they propagate Islam? You have to look at how their behavior was. They weren't violent. They're like Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, he says, that toleration extended towards Christian Arabs by victorious Muslims. They were tolerant towards them. If they couldn't pay the jizya, like Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, relating back to the point of the jizya, he even gave back the jizya to a tribe because he was unable to protect them. The Byzantines, they attacked them, and he was unable to protect them, so he gave back the jizya that he took from them. Imagine, Amir al-Mu'mineen, from his empire stretches from the steppes of China all the way to southern France, and he's giving back jizya to a tribe because he was unable to protect them. This is the behavior that they had. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, we go back to the pact he made and his conquest of Jerusalem. When he went, he refused to pray when the patriarch, when he was showing him around Jerusalem, they came up on the church and was showing him the church. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu realized it was the time of Asr, the prayer of Asr. And the patriarch, he out of his kindness says to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, why don't you go pray inside the church? You know, it's nice, quiet there. Nobody will come and disturb you. You can go pray there. Now, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, what he says is that I will not pray there, because if I pray there, then those who come after me, my followers, they will want to destroy the church and they will build a masjid there. Imagine, he is predicting that, if I do this, your church might be destroyed, so I'm not going to do it because I have toleration towards you. You are now under my protection and I will do what is necessary to protect you. This is how much toleration they had towards the non-Muslims. And this is why Sir Thomas Arnold Walker says that we can surely infer that those Christian tribes who did embrace Islam did so of their own free will. And they, this shows that they did it because they were taken aback and they were amazed by the character of the Sahaba and the Amir al-Mu'mineen, of course. So, yeah, that's all that we're going to cover in today's live stream. There will be more soon, inshallah. We will look more in depth into the later periods, such as the Umayyad Khilafah, the Abbasid Khilafah, and of course the Ottoman Empire, which was obviously in the more modern period of history. And as of course, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch on Instagram, Twitter, wherever you want. Be happy to get back to you. Any sources, anything you need, like the sources I stated today. Just one, the Sir Thomas Arnold Walker, the book where I stated many of the quotes from is called The Preaching of Islam. You will find that online, wherever. And so, yeah, if you have any questions, do get in touch. And thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.